Henry. I'll be talking about this. This is sort of a provisional topic of the book that I'm working on, which began as a kind of a study of contemporary politics or recent contemporary politics in Russia, and then it turns out that by the time you're ready to submit the book for publication, it turns out it's a history book by that point. So in some sense, what I'll be talking about today is a little bit of what is now history. Some of it even going back to the early 1990s. And Russia obviously has been in the news a lot. Stuff about Russian money, oligarchs, offshore jurisdictions, all of that kind of stuff has been on the radar. And I'm not going to talk about that too much. I'll mention some of it towards the end of the talk. But I think in order to really understand or to really kind of properly conceptualize and give proper historical background for what is happening right now, we really need to go back to the early days of the transition, or I'll be talking about the first 15 years of the post-Soviet transformation. So I became interested in this topic. Part of the reason was sort of the dissonance between what I was reading in the news about Russia and then what I was sort of studying or seeing when I was looking at academic work, particularly work in international finance, and because sort of reading financial press, this is maybe going back now about over 10 years ago. And so we all know the standard headlines out of Russia about harassment of opposition leaders, prosecution of various minority groups, occasional arrests of oligarchs, expropriation of oligarchs or other wealthy people, and then recently, of course, Russia's increasingly aggressive foreign military action. So those are the old types of news that we've been getting out of Russia now for well over a decade. But what we sort of don't seem to notice, it doesn't fully comport in my mind anyway, is this idea that as Russia became more and more authoritarian or politically closed, it's actually become more and more financially open, become more and more integrated into the world economy, but in particular into the global financial markets. So this is the blue line here is the Voice and Accountability Index, sort of kind of a proxy for democracy, produced by the World Bank, and this red dotted line is the Financial Openness Index, which tracks policies that are in place that restrict or enable movement of capital across the border. So Russia, really for the last 10 years or so, has been almost entirely, the Russian economy has been almost entirely financially open, and there's very few remaining regulations of the flow of capital in and out of the country. What is maybe even more puzzling or somewhat surprising is that Russia has become more financially integrated, become more financially open over this time without there being any major kind of improvements in the rule of law in the country. Now, that's not entirely true because there's some good evidence that when it comes to settling of disputes between private businesses, that the Russian court system has been actually making some progress. And Russia has moved up in like the rankings of doing business rankings and the like. But if you look at the sort of macro picture, it shows the restrictions on the executive and the kind of equality of application of law, at least according to this index, it's a World Bank index. The sort of perception of the rule of law have not changed in any significant way while Russia was sort of globalizing or becoming more and more financially integrated. And so a few questions that I'm going to talk about are, one is sort of what is the role of this complicated process of financial integration for our understanding of Russian political economy broadly. The more specific question for me is, why did the Russian government introduce particular financial openness policies when it did? And then probably more speculative, at least when it comes to this particular research, is sort of what does this continued commitment to open financial borders by Kremlin means for the regime now and into the future. I'll talk a little bit about that. So if you sort of read a little bit of international political economy, comparative political economy literature on this sort of big question about how the developing world, the emerging market economies, have been integrating into the global financial system. It's a really, really complicated question. We don't really have a single theory, in part because the process of financial integration is really complicated. It involves a variety of regulations. It sort of includes both formal and informal practices. So it's everything from sort of state regulation of capital movements and particular restrictions that are placed, to current regulations of currency exchanges, or something like even prudential. Some people study prudential policies for banking industry as a kind of an extension of capital account policies. So there's a complex set of policies. I'm mostly interested in the regulation of sort of the regulation of foreign ownership in the equity markets. That's sort of part of this complex issue that I'm working on. But in any case, one of the key assumptions in a lot of these theories, and there's been writing that's looked at, how does the types of political institutions, determine some of these policies? What about just generally the types of assets that are there? Does it make a difference if the economy is more based on kind of a specific asset base like oil and mineral wealth versus some of the more mobile type of assets? And then even something like sort of ideational proclivities of the policymakers. There's good literature out there that suggests that beliefs of ministers, finance ministers, and central bankers really play an important role in terms of the types of policy they choose to implement. But one of the key assumptions, and it's an assumption that I challenge, and it's an assumption that is obviously very questionable if you've studied anything about, if you've read about Russia, or if you studied the post-Soviet Russian transition, economic transition, is that one of the key assumptions that essentially the investments are I'm quoting from Jeffrey Friedman, who wrote this kind of one of the most influential articles on this question. The idea is that essentially control over the assets, or the activity, insofar as people are involved in those industries, they're caught in those activities. In other words, there's kind of a settlement of ownership and control rights over those assets. And I would suggest that you really can't understand the history of Russia's integration with the global financial markets over the last almost 30 years perhaps, without really understanding the process of sort of the internal struggles for asset control within the economy. Now, we know, going back to some of the sort of classic writings in political philosophy, is that there's this interesting relationship between sort of ability to move money and how it determines the relationship between sort of the economic, the merchant class, let's say, and the governments. And so Montesquieu, I've actually subsequently read some historiography about this. It's quite interesting. But Montesquieu had this kind of he wrote this with great reverence for Jewish traders of northern Italy who, sort of with the adoption of the Bill of Exchange, have been able to kind of avoid the vicissitudes and the very sort of expropriatory impulses of the city-states at that time. So how sort of technological advancement or the sort of adoption of this particular technology in the Bill of Exchange, how it essentially enabled the merchants to be sort of more independent in their political attitudes, to sort of be outside of the reach of the sovereign. And so we know from some of this recent research in political economy and political science that that there's a strong relationship, at least when it comes to understanding regime dynamics. But there's not really, if you think through some of these problems logically, is that in some sense Montesquieu might have been right, that actually ability to take your money abroad might make you more independent, might make you more likely to challenge the regime. What I think we actually see is quite the opposite, at least in Russia. But there's a couple of theories. One is this kind of long-term theory that Charles Bosch wrote in his 2003 book. And the idea is that as economies develop and grow, generally the asset base of the economy moves from sort of the specific asset base, from sort of immobile asset, into more mobile industries, into more kind of industries that involve human capital. So it's kind of a transition from I don't know, agriculture to kind of post-industrial consumer economy, perhaps based on business and capital and human capital and financial capital, which is much more mobile, obviously, than agriculture. And so he's argued, and there's some controversy about this in debates, but in any case, he's argued that essentially, by the nature of this process, it makes the wealthy elites in those countries much more likely to tolerate democracy, because essentially the voters aren't able to really credibly set the tax rates that they really want. It gives this extra source of leverage to the wealthy elites in their negotiation of institutions in the process of economic transition. There's been this subsequent work that suggests that not only these long-term changes, these changes that happen over decades and centuries, but even short-term changes in the policies of governments, adoption or relaxation of capital controls itself can actually change the overall mobility of assets that are generally located in that economy. So there's a couple of papers of the last 10 years. And the argument, it's a complicated argument also as related to levels of inequality and the like, but it also suggests that, for example, autocracies that are more financially open, if they, for whatever reason, go through a democratic transition, they're more likely to remain democracies because, for similar reasons that Bosch argued, that essentially gives them an extra bargaining chip against the sort of popularly elected governments who would want to insist on tax rates. There's another sort of work in literature that looks at this problem from a different perspective. So it doesn't look at it as kind of this problem of bargaining over tax rates between the rich and poor in the process of economic transition, but it looks at this sort of intra-elite bargain between, let's say, economic elites and political elites, and how they can use financial integration, financial openness to negotiate better or worse arrangements between one another. And the work there points to this opposite conclusion, that actually greater financial openness may lead to autocratic consolidation, or kind of it entrenches kind of oligarchic capitalism in a lot of these countries for a variety of reasons, but part of the reason is that essentially it allows the wealthy elites to access property right protections abroad, and therefore kind of maybe alleviates or lessens this potential for conflict, potential for expropriation that Montesquieu was talking about. So there's kind of these two ways of looking at it. Do rich people, do they fear marginal increases in marginal tax rates, or do they really worry about being expropriated? And my suggestion and the tack that I take here is to suggest that, yeah, rich people care more about that 100% tax rate as opposed to 100% wealth tax, as opposed to sort of a marginal tax in their income, at least in the very short term. So if you think of sort of yourself as a Russian oligarch who's come into all this wealth through various nefarious semi-legal ways 15 years ago, you really have benefited from absence of the rule of law, kind of a weak court system. So and many of them continue to get access to financial flows, financial resources to this day, in part because they can keep out competition. They kind of use relational capital, informal influence in the governments to maintain access to this resources, or they've gotten their wealth originally. But then once you have your wealth, and once you have your resources, you become the subject to the same problem, because you essentially want to protect your assets. You want to be able to gain some measure of property rights protections, and so you find yourself in this kind of dilemma. And so if you know a little bit about Russian political economy over the last 20, 30 years, is that you know that the rich people have invented a variety of sort of ways of dealing with this problem. So in the 1990s, there was this common use of, the oligarchs had relied even on private armies to protect themselves against competitors because they couldn't count on the state. And so you kind of guard you're literally guarding your sort of physical control over some of these factories and mines and the like. Now, in terms of corporate governance, there emerged this essentially almost universal majority block holding model of corporate governance in Russia, because it really doesn't make sense to sort of, if you talk to an American wealth manager, financial advisor, they'll tell you have a diversified portfolio, invest in as many stocks, whatever it is, so you be diversified, invest into an index fund, and that's what you want to do. Now, if you're a Russian oligarch, that's a bad strategy for you because minority shareholder protections are very weak in Russia. They're better now, but especially in those days, they're completely non-existent. So if you really want to make sure that you control a given asset, you want to control overwhelming majority of shares, and so that you can fire managers at will. And this is kind of a potential solution to this dilemma that they're talking about. Now, neither of those things really helps against the state. As Vladimir Putin came to power, the power was centralized, and there was this kind of return to state ownership in the economy. A lot of the oligarchs began kind of considering that sort of the number one problem. And in the course of writing about this, I found Vladimir Yevtushenko, some of the early sayings of Vladimir Yevtushenko to be quite prophetic, actually. But so I like this quote from him. And I think there was the state visit. There was a big Russian delegation that came to Canada, and now Foreign Minister of Canada was interviewing Vladimir Yevtushenko in 2000, and he sort of prophetically said, it was very early, a few months after Putin came into office, he said, well, I cannot say that the state is always right, but you cannot fight the state. And of course, he, 14 years later, found himself in these really indecorous Russian, sort of these cages that they put defendants in Russian courtrooms. But so what I'm talking about in the book, and let me just kind of specify it a little bit more technically. So what I'm talking about in the book is I'm talking about this concept of financial access and the extent to which foreign investors can access domestically listed Russian securities. And so what I'm trying to explain is by looking at and explain the variation in extent to which Russian assets are accessible to foreign investors in the course of this period between 1992 and 2006 or so, by looking at how the preference of the key asset holders with respect to financial accessibility changed. So I looked at both the de jure practices, the legal practices that are instilled by the government, but also some of the informal practices that a lot of local asset holders used to either bring in foreign investors or to exclude them from competition. And in particular, I'm focusing on development of the stock exchange, the Moscow Stock Exchange, which became in 2011 Moscow Exchange when the two exchanges merged. And so I look at sort of how did the oligarchs decide to resolve this problem, and it isn't something that happened recently, but essentially goes back really to the very early 1990s. But essentially, this kind of system emerged by which you want to maintain local control over a given asset, and because property rights are really insecure, you want to sort of maintain your control over those assets by having informal relationships with people in a position of power. So you want to, it's always kind of contingent. You're never really sure that you can ultimately control an asset, but there's also advantages to it because you can exclude competitors and you can kind of get access to things that other people can't. That's sort of the nature of oligarchy. There's politically connected wealthy elites. And then over the course of this time, you begin sort of promoting and offering minority ownership rights in your assets to foreign investors, really for two major set of reasons. One is you actually do want to access liquidity and investment capital from abroad. But another important thing is that you want to legitimize the wealth that you've acquired, usually through rather questionable practices. And so this offers this kind of second best solution where you can maintain local control, maintain informal influence in domestic politics, take advantage of the lack of kind of formal rule of law, and at the same time you can legitimize ownership of those assets by accessing foreign jurisdictions, foreign legal systems, and banking and finance industries abroad. So yes, this is how I think one can understand shifts in the policies that regulate foreign ownership, minority foreign ownership in the Russian equities market. So you can see here, this is a data set put together by these two researchers, Edison and Warnock, and it hasn't been updated since 2006, as far as I know. But this is one indicator of the foreign ownership restrictions in Russian equities. And you can see there's kind of around 2005, 2006, there's this major drop-off where essentially there's very few remaining restrictions. And it's been this way since that time. There was a number of other reforms that were introduced in July of 2006, but this was one of the key implications. I'm going to quickly skip through some of the episodes. So in the book I talk about how this system developed in the course of 3 episodes. I talk about the voucher privatization between 1992 and 94. I look at kind of the loans for shares auctions and Yeltsin's re-election and the subsequent stock market boom that followed it for a couple of years. And then I look at another redistribution of asset control that happened under Putin, I think somewhere between 2001 and 2005 or something like that. So in the voucher privatization, the kind of the winning group that had a lot of influence over policy at that time were these insider managers, the Soviet era insider managers, who for a variety of complicated reasons were able to maintain kind of actually primarily informal control over a lot of those industries. And I show and document how in the course of revising the privatization program, they essentially lobbied to exclude foreign investors from competition in the voucher privatization. But then once the voucher privatization ended in the mid-1994, really at the end of 93, but officially in the middle of 1994, there was this kind of newfound enthusiasm for investors, and there was this brief but quite significant stock market boom in Russia in 1990, sort of the fall of 93 and fall of 94, where almost entirely foreign portfolio investment has kind of brought valuations of these companies significantly, and $2 billion is a very small amount in modern day. But when the stock market crashed, when there was a currency crisis in the fall of 1994, later that year, I think the entire, the valuation of the entire sort of economy was something on the order of what the Kmart Corporation was worth in the United States. So a lot of these valuations are sort of, they change dramatically over the years. But $2 billion, there's different estimates, but something like up to $2 billion in foreign portfolio investment came at that time. And I really like this quote from this one hedge fund manager who was there in 95, that essentially there was a lot of stealing, and this is by no means the sort of the main story. Like, let's say, if you wanted to go back in the time machine and understand what's happening in Russia, this is by no means the main story that was happening at all. But I do think that it's nice when he said, when the managers figure out that you can get rich by selling stock as opposed to just stealing from the company, that's when the real change will happen in the Russian economy. And I really think that that's the direction in which the transition went. And similarly, in this loans for shares incident, when the Russian government instituted this program by which they received loans from some of the wealthy people in Russia in exchange, and they gave shares in some of the remaining unprivatized large, really very valuable companies. Eventually, these loans were never paid back, so these individuals established sort of majority control. Some of them had minority interests in those companies, but they ultimately established majority control over some of the more valuable companies then. And I document in the book about how all of these oligarchs essentially, while there was this sort of ongoing settlement of control rights over these assets, essentially did all kinds of different things. There's famous stories about closing of airports and moving, meetings to new locations in last minute and all this kind of stuff. But they even teamed up with the Communist Party, which held a significant, was the largest opposition party in the Duma, to kind of resist the possibility of inviting foreign investors to some of these auctions. But then again, once they established control over these assets, they kind of changed their attitude and sort of became much more welcoming to foreign investors. And Russia experiences this sort of very large stock market boom, where in those 2 years, in 96, 97, there was this over 100% return in dollar terms to investments in the Russian stock market. And there's a great deal of wealth made, although of course it ends pretty badly for a variety of other complicated reasons in August of 1998. What is interesting when you turn to this episode under the Putin rule and this new reassignment of control, this new reshuffling of ownership over key assets in the economy, is that the government or the new kind of set of powerful individuals, state-connected oligarchs of various sorts, to what extent they begin using the same script. And so I focus in particular on the two biggest takeovers in this, Rosneft and Gazprom. But Russian state returns to being one of the primary players in the Russian economy. It regains control over the main oil and gas production assets, and quite explicitly, government officials at this time, a lot of the oligarchs from the 90s, or private oligarchs of that day, actually wanted to push to liberalize the capital controls and a variety of other policies to make it easier for foreign investors, non-resident investors, to participate in the Russian equity markets. Some of them even threatened to sue the government in the constitutional court, which was then did not seem like a laughable idea perhaps at that time. So, but the government officials were quite explicit that they wanted to reestablish majority control particularly over Gazprom and Rosneft, and that these policies would not be introduced and were delayed over the course of a few years until the government had majority control over those assets. And so in 2006, in July of 2006, in anticipation of hosting the G8 summit in St. Petersburg that year, the government finally introduces a number of reforms, capital account reforms, but among other things, they removed this dual trading. There used to be this policy of ring fence where foreign investors could now buy domestically traded shares of Gazprom. They removed, they sort of liberalized trading in Gazprom shares at the time. Famously, this is around the same time they went ahead with the IPO, initial public offering of Rosneft in London, and a variety of other policies that eased the restriction on foreign minority ownership of Russian assets. I'd like to show this picture just for nostalgia. This is something that actually happened, and it's hard to believe. But yeah, this is Vladimir Putin hosting the G8 summit in St. Petersburg in 2006, just near 13 years ago. So the capitalization of companies like Gazprom and Rosneft around this time go through the roof. Eventually, they come down for a variety of other external reasons. I think this chart here with Rosneft. Rosneft really practically didn't exist as a company in the early 2000s, and then once it acquires their essentially stolen or expropriated Yukos assets, goes through this initial public offering in London, also for reasons of having, in large part, having to do with sort of legitimizing this new round of redistribution of asset control. And so the story for me kind of stops at that point, and I focus on this process by which Russia really spurts, connected with the reassignment and redistribution of control over assets within the economy, and spurts becomes more and more financially open. But Russia has remained financially open to this day, and so what is really interesting, and I think it's sort of a separate question, but the question is, why has the Putin regime maintained this commitment to financial openness? And this openness is actually quite dangerous, and Russia experienced tremendous capital outflows. It was the worst performing stock market in the world in 2008, among the emerging markets in 2008 and 2009. And there was a lot of reckoning with saying, how come we're so vulnerable to these short-term flows of capital flows? There was some talk of reintroducing capital controls after the financial crisis. But over the years, and even as recently as a couple of years ago, Central Bank of Russia did not even want to consider a possibility of removing, of instituting capital controls. And so a variety of reforms in 2006, the sort of full-scale capital account reforms, but then there's the liberalization of the foreign exchange, which has had a different set of important causes as well. There's important kind of institutional technical reforms in the Russian stock market that even in the midst of this kind of confrontation with the West and the sanctions regime, the Moscow exchange, the Russian stock market continues to be this kind of at the forefront of being this really well-functioning institution that's deeply integrated into the global trading platforms. In 2013 and 14, the Moscow Exchange joined these European clearing houses, which made it easier, or at least made it, I guess, made trading on Russian exchanges much more safe for foreign investors. Last year they introduced sponsored market access, so that if you have a Bank of America brokerage account today, you can go ahead and trade in Russian stocks from the comfort of your seat. And as the sanctions have been ramped up over the last couple of years, there's been some talk that essentially Moscow Stock Exchange, in terms of the accessibility of Russian assets and sort of the channel of integration with the global financial system, it's sort of we're kind of almost like the last game in town. That they've suffered in various ways, and they've had to adopt, but more or less even today you can pull up your smartphone and download an app and start trading Russian securities. So in sum, so I showed that in these 3 key episodes of the first 15 years of economic transformation in Russia, in several episodes, domestic elites, while the control rights over assets were being protested and fought for, they opposed foreign minority ownership in the assets, and then once they got to majority control rights, they began welcoming foreign minority and actually lobbied for institutional changes, policy reforms, and even informally for easier access for foreign investors to Russian assets. And then finally, in 2006, this sort of local control combined with worldwide accessibility became kind of official policy of the Russian government, which was sort of happy conclusion both for the private oligarchs of the sort of made their wealth before Putin came to power, and for this new emergent group of Silivarchs, oligarchs, these sort of Putin's cronies, Putin's friends. And so a couple of implications, I think, for sort of the literature for the study of integration of the non-rich world into the global financial system that was really set up by the United States, Great Britain, essentially a Western, it's called global financial system, but it's very hierarchical. It's primarily based in London and New York. And so, but the choices about integrating into that financial system in a lot of the developing world where property rights are poorly protected has very little to do actually with the types of assets that are there, a variety of other factors. But I think we need to kind of re-examine the extent to which contestability of property rights really matters for that. Basically, maybe people are just interested in protecting their assets. And surprisingly, this is not something that has been studied a great deal in literature. And at least in the case of Russia, the history of financial integration of Russia is really closely linked. I mean, there's a variety of other issues that are important, but it's really closely linked to this continuous reconfiguration of asset control within the countries. And I think with respect to some of these recent sanctions, I think it's clear to me that insofar as Montesquieu was right, and mobility of capital makes sort of merchants more independent from the whims of princes and the like, insofar as Western countries reduced the sort of mobility of the oligarchic assets, it sort of tilts the advantage, at least in the short term, towards the government. Maybe there's in the longer term there will be sort of much more productive outcomes, and it's likely that sanctions policy to be a long-term policy. But another thing that I wanted to say, and this is I came across this quote by Alexander Grishko, and that's the last slide, and I'll stop talking. But he was writing in 1945. He was working for maybe the Treasury, or he was working in the government at that time. Alexander Grishko is perhaps the greatest historian of Soviet Russia and Imperial Russia. I was a professor at Harvard for many years. But he was sort of advocating it was this brief period of sort of friendly relations between the Soviet Union and the West, and he was sort of pleading for taking an opportunity or using this momentum to reintegrate the Soviet economy back into sort of global economy. And the argument he was making there is sort of it would be better for European consumers. They would be able to get access to all these natural resources and agricultural products, and it would sort of bring into Russia, this should be a key imperative of bringing Russia back into the global economy. And for whatever you think of the post-Soviet economic transformation that happened in Russia and the policy choices that were made, and I have some of my own strong opinions, this project has been generally successful. You know, despite the sanctions and despite the kind of the current moment and this new Cold War, whatever you want to call it, Russia has never been more integrated into the global economic system in the past. And it's part of the reason why the sanctions policy is actually sort of a complicated arena now, is that Treasury Department openly admits this by saying that by sanctioning a lot of the Russian entities, or by making it difficult for foreigners to buy official Russian sovereign debt, it could actually create, it could really damage, or it could really harm the interests of, you know, American citizens, American hedge funds, American pension funds, and the like. So the process of integration and interdependence is significant enough that by punishing Russia today, the United States itself is actually looking to lose something as well. And so that's sort of, I think, often gets missed in the story, but you know, Gazprom and Rosneft continue to be these very significant producers of natural resources. Europeans are very dependent on those. Russia is the largest exporter of wheat now. You know, Boeing depends on a third of its production of its planes on Russian aluminum. And so there's these important interdependencies that exist today. And disentangling from them turns out to be actually much more difficult. And in that sense, maybe Gershon was right. That sort of like, by bringing Russia back into economy, whatever else happens, maybe it will make it difficult to sort of to go back to this you know, autarkic coexistence. So that's it, and we have 20 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe I'll just ask, I mean, you could take questions from there, up here, wherever you want.
Okay.
So maybe I'll just pose the first question, which is, I think one thing isn't entirely clear to me in your story. I mean, you talk about kind of the oligarchs or the firm perspective, but like, you know, what as part of your story is kind of driving the Kremlin support for open financial markets? Is it kind of just that you have a strong group of technocrats, you know, in government who kind of have Putin's ear and he listens to and thinks it's wise economic policy? Is this part of kind of a strategy of kleptocracy, right? That you have to kind of let the people who around you are stealing, you know, be able to realize their goods abroad, and that ultimately outweighs the risks that might come with granting them independence. You know, these would be like very different stories. Maybe there's a different story. I just wonder, kind of, I mean, I know you can't get into Putin's head, but like, what's, yeah,
right.
what would be your?
It's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough to say, but there's so the one thing that's true is that there was this. It's clear that like the Union of Industrialists and what what's that organization, the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
So it's clear that like they lobbied early on because, you know, they, as a response to the 1998 crisis, they essentially they introduced a lot of capital controls, and a lot of those remained on the books as Putin became president. But there was this lobbying effort even early on to open the economy, and it made sense why like a lot of the 90s oligarchs would prefer that. And so it's clearly was one of the ways, I think, to appease that crowd or to sort of come to a peaceful understanding post-Yukos. I think there's probably a little bit of that. So there wasn't, who were the people who were against it, you know? And then I think it's clear to me that there was this interest in gaining better access to Western financial markets. And I think there was probably this effort to sort of, especially when it comes to Rosneft, to legitimize this new entity that didn't really used to exist, and now it's become this large, you know, one of maybe the largest oil company in the world. And there was this, if you read the financial press around this time, there was actually a great deal of you know, consternation in the West. Or, you know, there was all of this kind of, I mean, these articles they get rewritten over and over, but this critique of the London Stock Exchange in particular about how willing they are to sort of launder this dirty money and etc. and all this. But it's interesting that over the course of these different episodes, there's this interest, foreign investment, different infrastructure, Western banks and the like. There's a lot of interest, of course, there. The local oligarchs were for it. The state was, you know, wants to gain control of these assets, they were for it. And so the interesting question, and I don't fully understand, and I think it has something to do with their ability, this confidence with which they knew that they could control, I don't know if it's sort of redistribution of populism or just the fact that they control the political system entirely. But I think they underestimated the downside of this openness, and they found it in 2009. So, what's the name of the head of the railroad? Yakunin. So Yakunin says in spring of 2009, what is this financial openness? I never signed off on this. Like it's sort of a lot of the sort of hardliners in the government, hardliners at the time, of course. But there was this sort of realization. I was like, oh, we're so exposed. Look at all this money going on. But I think they've actually managed the downside pretty well there. And then there's this continued. The policy's been in place. And another part of the story, the reason why policies remain in state is because there's reputational concern at stake, and so you really want to continue signaling to the market that Russia continues to be an open economy. So there's that too. But it is somewhat puzzling.
Okay, great. Yeah. Just introduce yourself,
Yeah,
please.
I
I would kind of know your
Yeah.
story.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, and sorry that I was slightly late. By and large, I think it's excellent ideas you have, but so let me pick on where I'm not quite on the board. I think that the way to look upon Russia in this period is from oligarchy to kleptocracy, or if you want a syllabic role. And I would not, as you discuss the policy making, see different policy groups. I would focus on Putin's interest. So I look upon 2000 to 2003. This is a balance between, within the government, Voloshin, Kasyanov, the oligarchic group, against Putin. And this is the best economic policy Russia ever had. You can compare that with Erdogan's first period, 2002, 2006, and then it's going down. So I see the Yukov's nationalization as the big step to the state sector. And that very interesting. I haven't thought of bringing in Montesquieu, which I will read up on after hearing your talk. But that makes a lot of sense. But I think 2006 is the big liberalization of the current account when Russia is becoming more state capitalist. So why? Because Putin has got control over his money machine then, and he needs to take out the money. So what general financial analysts were very surprised at was what you quoted Yakunin here, that in a crisis as 2008, 2009, when Russia in 1 year, 2008, lost 200 billion in capital outflow, you impose capital control. I mean, several European countries did. And Russia did not. Why? Because it was not in Putin's and his cronies' interest. And to me, that shows how strong they were. But at this stage, they could really ignore the interest of the country and focus on their personal interest. So I think that this is a very interesting point. And then I see Putin's informal third period as the period of asset stripping. Because what you don't bring in here, you take how stock prices increased, but then they plummeted, and they have state loan. So you can, from this, surmise that Putin has sold his Gazprom stocks, that he doesn't care about stock value. But Gazprom has gone from a peak of 369 billion in May 2008 to now about 55 billion. This means that stock price is irrelevant to them. There are other values that they look for in Gazprom. Similarly with Rosneft. So it's not. So if you look up on the stock market today in Russia, it's irrelevant. It's really irrelevant. It is. Is it 1/3 or half of what it once was in market capitalization? There are no IPOs, and it's not, doesn't attract Western money. So it's sort of a remnant of something that existed until 2008. I would, so now the issue is for Putin and his friends that they can get out the money. And my educated guess is that Putin and friends take out $15 to $25 billion a year. And they take it out, and we have these, Sergei Ignatieff statements in June 2013 about one group taking out $25 billion, and which must be Putin and friends.
Yeah, I know your book is just about to come out, or it just came out, right?
It will be out next month.
Yeah,
Russia's crony capitalism, but
right.
I'm very much discussing these things.
Yeah, so I'd like to. It's hard for me, and I don't know what to make of it. This is part of the reason why I like carrying the wishes book, and it's maybe this is sort of psychological, something about just literally talking about them stealing it, like in these kind of like find it a little bit difficult to maybe there's some kind of cognitive dissonance that they're literally selling, like they have some kind of stock in Gazprom. I guess you can see it through volume of trading maybe or something. You can just sort of pick certain incidents. You're able to see that?
Yeah, I mean, you see that the capital outflow is between $30 and $45 billion each year on average.
Right.
So it's a steady flow. So the total Russian assets held abroad are probably $800 billion to $1 trillion, assuming that there's been minimal return on it.
Well, and so this is where at least I'd like to say that I'm staking out a slightly different ground because it's clear that capital flight and illicit capital flows. I mean that goes back even to the Soviet days, right? So I'm not saying that this has somehow made it easier to take money out. Although there's been scandals about differential trading on the Moscow, the Deutsche Bank scandal. Like so there's ways of sort of launder money a little. But I think to me it's a story about kind of accessing Western jurisdictions and getting and legitimizing this asset as a partial protection against expropriation within the country. I think abusing, favoring, or making it easier for foreign investors to have minority positions in these companies. That's sort of because I think there's no trouble in getting money out of the country per se. That's not precisely what I'm talking about.
No,
It's more about legitimization of these assets.
Maybe sorry, if we could maybe bring a few people up and then we can continue. We don't have a whole lot of time, sorry, but it's.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Igor. My name is Paul Massaro. I advise at the U.S. Helsinki Commission, led by 9 senators and 9 representatives. I do economics and anti-corruption. So your work here is very interesting to me. I just recently finished Alex Cooley's book, Dictators Without Borders, about very similar phenomena occurring in Central Asia. And I was just wondering, I'm most concerned about how this, this using Western institutions to legitimize, as you say, control at home, control locally, work globally, and ultimately you want to make sure you're controlling a little bit in the West too. Just you want to get the right outcomes, things like that. And whether you could highlight any particular ways that sort of the dictatorships of Central Asia and the way that they have been doing the very similar thing, control locally, and I like your mantra here, local control, worldwide access, is different or similar than the ways you found with the Russian elite.
I think so I can talk a little bit about Kazakhstan, where they've actually, in some ways, they were kind of earlier to this. So they liberalized earlier. There was this state control of the economy was kind of, there was a lot more of it going back to the 1990s. So in some sense, this model, they were kind of early to it, even earlier than Russia in some sense. I think the story of like Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, I'm from Kyrgyzstan, so there's just straight up, I think that there's more of a new regime comes in, they want to get the cell phone company was controlled by a son of the previous president. It was registered in British Virgin Islands. How do we get regain control over it? How we get those financial flows? What kind of legal representation we need to have, and all that kind of stuff. So, whereas I think in Russia, it's really more of a a story where you want to kind of be in this constant position where you having kind of this informal relationship with people in power, but you never could really fully trust that this relationship will last to tomorrow. I think part of the reason, by the way, why a lot of the Putin-era oligarchs have been favoring these policies, I think they precisely understand that the assets that they've got to control now used to be controlled by some other folks, 10 years ago. They're not sure if Putin changes his mind tomorrow or somebody else comes to power. So they're under the same kind of
So you really believe they're hedging against the loss of their position or potentially the fall of the regime?
So, in some sense, yeah, I think so. I mean, you want to make sure you can pass it on to your children and that kind of, yeah. You can't trust in this because in this sort of prevalent informality. You can't really trust anybody. You also benefit from informality, sort of T1, and so you want to make sure how do I hold on to my assets to the T, time 2. And I think this accessibility of global financial infrastructure makes it possible. But another big part of the story, and I'll stop there, is that Russia has a big economy. It has a fairly large, by regional standards, stock market. And so a lot of these policies have more, like Kyrgyzstan has a stock market, but it's a really decrepit building. I know where it's located, and it's not a thriving institution, just because it's such a small economy. And then similarly, Kazakhstan tried to build a local stock exchange. It's sort of, it's very shallow. There's not a lot of trading happening, so a lot of the companies go to London.
Thank you.
Okay, go last.
First, I want to second Henry's point about the need to pinpoint the mechanism of how this happened. Is it a structural outcome of the situation of capitalist Russia, seeing certain seeing certain advantages to being integrated? Is it a structural mechanism? Who are the actors who are pushing through this? And if financial openness has been achieved, does it mean, you are saying that it is to protect property rights. Does it mean that businesses have won over the state in this situation and state's policy making with regard to allowing business actors to protect their property rights? And then the de-offshoreization rhetoric that started in 2013, what do we make of it? Is it simply a political gesture to the public, aware of these processes of hiding capital abroad? What do you make of it? And is there any information about results of this, quote-unquote de-offshoreization campaign or policy or whatnot? So there are two things, right? So on the one hand, I think there is a need in theory in terms of, how policymaking is done. Is it, again, good good ministers who understand the needs of the capital in Russia? Or is it those who are close to Putin's ears, as Anders is suggesting, who are putting these policies through, and that those are two, they would have the same outcome, but would mean very different things about the regime and policy making and state bureaucracy, etc. And the second is about the de-offshoreization.
It's a really astute question, and I was in this negotiation debate with some reviewers about this very point. It's like, do they actually make policy, or do these people just? And I've weaseled my way out of it by basically saying that I'm just looking at the preferences of these, and they basically change based on the extent to which they control these assets. But if you look at the policies, the way they were made in '96, there was a whole other, a number of there was significant IMF pressure. They really needed these loans, and it was also politically much more competitive situation with the elections and the like. But it's clear to me that both through various formal actions and also supporting policy initiatives and technological changes that were happening at the stock exchange, I think I can demonstrate that there's a change in preferences, but in terms of when and how actual policies were implemented, I think there's various other inputs that are also important. I think the finance ministry and the central bank, I think they generally believe these are better macro policies. And the other one, I haven't gone over it, but in the penultimate chapter, I took penultimate chapter of my book. I go through the Cyprus crisis, the de-offshorization of the bank, and I can send it to you. But my basic impression that it's all a lot of it is for show. I think one is another lever to control the bureaucracy. I think there's a little bit of that element too, but ultimately it didn't really amount to anything. I mean, if they really wanted to put an end to it, they would. But I think there was some successes. Some people brought the money back on shore, and they were. There was a funny story. They were trying to induce these oligarchs, or these wealthy individuals, to bring their money back into Russia, and they would even enticing them with these higher than market interest rates to put them in to guarantee these high returns in Russian state bonds. But the funny thing is that I don't know whatever happened, what came of that. But these folks were only interested in doing it if the clearing happened in Europe. Like they weren't trusting local custodial firms and clearing houses. So they said, so long as it goes through Belgium, then we'll sort of like, we'll give her some of our money, but so long as we can legally kind of rectify it in Belgium. We don't really trust Russian jurisdictions, obviously. So I think that was really indicative of the way some of those folks think about it. But
all right, well, unfortunately, we're already at 5 o'clock, so I think we're going to have to bring it to a close. But hopefully we can continue the discussion informally. I think this is a topic, right? You're on to something really interesting and big, right? We could probably spend hours discussing.